it's always a delight to have large trees in the yard, like this stately old maple behind us. But the shade they cast can be a challenge for gardeners.
It's an exciting challenge, though, because for a number of plants, shade is a big plus.
That's right. There's a wide choice of shade-loving plants. I'm Elliot Coleman.
And I'm Barbara Damrosch. And if you'll stay with us for the next half hour, we'll give you some tips on the shady side of your gardening life. And we'll visit a botanical garden called Garden in the Woods.
On Gardening Naturally.
If you have a shady yard, can you have a garden?
Well, nature gardens in the shade, maybe not in the total shade of a dense forest, but we're out here in the woods and there's a little dappled sun coming through.
And look what's growing around us, Elliot. Some bunch berries. Look at the little red berries, Elliot. Some mosses. Some grasses here. Some ferns. And even some tree seedlings like this arborvitae or that little maple seedling over there.
You know, this is what happens whenever a tree falls in the forest and opens up a little hole in the canopy so some light can get in.
And there are a lot of beautiful garden plants that do fine in a shaded setting as well. And a very good place to take a look at those is Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts. Hello, Heather.
Hi, Barbara.
Heather McCargo is in charge of propagation at Garden in the Woods, and she's going to be my guide today. This is a busy place, Heather.
It is. That's the noise you hear in the background is our new horticulture building.
Always growing.
Yes.
You know, it's so nice to come to a place which is pure suburban sprawl, this area right next to Boston, and find something which looks like primeval forest. It's a beautiful woodland, this huge tall trees, oaks and pines, and then understory shrubs and trees. How much of this was planned?
Well, it's actually quite young forest. All of New England was deforested during the colonial era, and it's part of the great eastern deciduous forest, which stretches from Maine down to Georgia and west to the prairie states. About 100 years ago is when most of the agriculture was abandoned in New England, and so this forest is less than 100 years old. What we have done here is a little bit of selective thinning, and then we planted mid-story and understory trees and shrubs to make it more multi-age, which is one of the characteristics of a more mature forest.
I see. So you've made it actually look older by not letting everything grow up the same height, the same age.
Yes.
And it's a richer environment as a result.
Yes.
Now, if somebody wanted to come in and do that, how much would they want to thin out?
They want to be very careful. The big mistake that most people make is they thin it too much, and they cut down all the young trees and just leave the big mature trees and let in a lot of sunlight, and then they get raspberries or poison ivy or some other aggressive species. So you need to be very careful.
A little bit the way nature does it, a little bit at a time.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to take a little closer look at what some of these understory plants are. Okay. I might want to plant some. Heather, Garden in the Woods is famous for its native plant collection. Is this a native rhododendron?
Yeah, that's a catawba rhododendron, Rhododendron catabaense, and has beautiful magenta flowers in June. Behind it, we have another native rhododendron. That's the rosebay rhododendron, and it has a white flower in July.
How tall does that one get?
That one in the south can get up to 25 feet tall, really be a small tree almost. But this far north, 10 to 15 feet is large for it.
Now, mountain laurel is another one that's great in the woods.
Yes, and that's a very easy to cultivate woodland shrub.
And beautiful when it blooms in June with pink and white blossoms. I love the idea of having small understory trees like this.
That's the Carolina silverbell, Foliage.
Oh, and isn't that lovely?
Yeah, it has a beautiful, this is a young one, but as it matures, it will have a whole line of beautiful bell-like flowers hanging down from it just before the leaves come out.
It's from the Carolinas, but it does fine here.
Yes.
Now, this viburnum.
Yep, that's hobblebush, Viburnum alnifolium. Has white flowers before the leaves come out in the spring, and then berries that change from red to black, and birds love.
I'd love to grow that plant.
Also right next to it is one of our native yew, Taxus canadensis. Most people plant either the Japanese or the European yews, which are actually trees, and so they have to shear them to keep them small. This one's wonderful because it stays low and open and has a very natural shape to it.
And it's perfect in a naturalistic planting like this one. Now, we have a lot of trouble with deer eating our yews. Does that happen here?
Well, it's funny. We have some of the foreign yews in the garden, and when we get deer in here, they always eat that first. So that will be completely defoliated, and they won't have even touched these.
Well, how about that? Another good reason to grow it.
Yeah.
Here's another good understory tree, that flowering dogwood.
Yes, one of our most beautiful woodland trees.
I think that's one of everybody's favorites. Now, this is one that's less familiar to people, but I wish people would grow it more.
Yeah, that's a white form of the red bud, which is a southern native understory tree. It actually in the wild grows a lot with the dogwoods and has beautiful white little flowers.
It looks like what you've created is the perfect framework here for flowers that will grow in the shade.
We have, and this is the blue phlox and the wild ginger that you're seeing here, and if you follow me this way, we'll see a lot more.
Heather, how shady is shady? What type of shade do you really like to have best for this garden?
Well, actually, varying degrees of shade are ideal. Full shade conditions are good for things like ferns or some of the shrubs, evergreen shrubs that can tolerate full shade. Right here we have a hole in the canopy where there's no big trees right here, so we get a couple hours of direct sun and then full shade the rest of the day. And a lot of the woodland wildflowers love those kind of conditions.
Well, this leucothoi is something that I think of as a very shade-loving plant.
Yeah, leucothoi will tolerate dense, dark shade. Here it gets those couple hours of sun, which it can tolerate, although it's perfectly happy in full shade. Right here is one of our native azaleas, Rhododendron vasei, and it blooms better if it does get a couple hours of sun like it does here. It will grow in full shade, you just won't get quite as many blossoms.
Right. It's so pretty the way they laid this path with the stones coming down, very natural. And the little tiny flowers tucked in here and there, like that white violet just under the step. And this foam flower, look, they did the same thing here. I love foam flower. That's a great little woodland plant.
Yeah, it's beautiful and cracked. Over here we have a variegated phloxstone, so we'll ramble along the hillside here.
And it's happy in this part shade.
Yep.
And look at that.
Yeah, that's the Japanese painted fern, and that attracts a lot of attention because of the color of its foliage, which is kind of a silvery purple.
And red stems, reddish stems that are very handsome. There's a pretty plant here, that white one, Heather.
That's a wild geranium, and that's a white form of it. And it does beautifully in that part shade conditions with a couple hours of sunlight also.
Here's another white plant that I normally see a different color.
Yeah, that's the European bleeding heart. And there's a white form and a pink one, which is farther down the path. And that's a true spring ephemeral, which means it blooms in the spring, produces seed, and then goes dormant in the summertime. So that plant will completely disappear in July.
Is that because it gets sunlight early before the leaves come out, and then it's too shady later on?
Yes.
There's a very dramatic plant behind it with those huge leaves.
That's a Japanese Simicifuga, or bugbane. And it has white spikes of flowers in September.
Oh, that's lovely, just for the leaves alone. And this one, too. Look at the red coloration on that foliage.
Epimedium. And that's really grown for its leaves. It does have small pink flowers, but it's really grown for its ornamental foliage.
If I put one plant there, will it spread?
Yeah, it will increase in size every year, and pretty soon you'll have a big patch.
Now, what if I didn't have a hole in my canopy? What if I just had canopy and lots of shade? Could I still have a pretty garden?
Yes. You'd have to be more selective about your species. Underneath this hemlock tree, where there's not a drop of sunlight, is that drooping leucothoi again, and it does beautifully in full shade. It will even bloom in shade, and it doesn't need any light. Over here is another azalea, and this is a good example of a plant that is perfectly healthy in full shade, but it will not bloom as heavily. And here you can see it just has a few scattered flowers.
Well, over here is a plant that a lot of people grow in shade.
Hostas are classic shade garden plants.
And there's so many different kinds. I mean, there's 4 right here. There's a plain dark green leaf. There's a yellowish one with a green margin, and a green one with a yellow margin, and one with a white margin. And I know that there's dozens that people sell. I can see why people collect those.
Yes. And let me show you, we do have some other plants here that are grown just for their foliage, some red leaf foliage, such as some of the coral bells or heucheras. Some of those species have very red mottled leaves. Also, another well-known one for its red foliage is Rogersia.
Oh, that's a beautiful plant on those tall stems with the light shining through the red leaves.
Yeah, they're almost coppery.
Yeah, you could get by with plenty of color just with foliage alone, couldn't you?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for showing me this and just giving me a little bit more of an idea of what New England has to offer in its woods.
Good, we'll come back. There's a lot here for you.
We've just scratched the surface. I'll definitely come back. Thank you. Growing a lawn under a tree is a challenging project and often not a very successful one. Most grasses really need sun to do well. And under a tree, you often have problems with tree roots that come up, making mowing difficult. So usually your grass looks something like this. Not great. Fortunately, there's some much better alternatives. In the forest, you wouldn't have grass under a big tree like this one. You'd have little ground covers, herbaceous perennials, wildflowers. That's the kind of thing that you ought to grow under trees. To get rid of the grass under this tree, you could take a sharp spade and strip off the sod the way you would on any lawn area, but that's a lot of work, and it's going to be doubly difficult because of the tree roots here. It's also going to perhaps harm the tree roots that are close to the surface. So I've got a better suggestion. Spread something out that will kill the grass. Now, a lot of people would use black plastic, which would be fine in an area where you don't have to look at it, or if you don't mind dealing with black plastic, which I'd always rather avoid. So I'm going to show you another trick that I like even better. I'm going to take some newspapers, and I'm going to spread these out over the grass, maybe 4 or 5 sheets thick, like this. It's sometimes easier if you weight it down with rocks as you go, especially if it's a windy day. And just keep spreading till I've covered the whole area. I cover as large an area as I think I want to plant. Probably ideally, I'd want to make a circle all the way around the tree. And the next step would be to cover it with something. In this case, I've chosen some finely shredded bark mulch. I'm just going to dump that on top of the newspaper, nice and thick. I want to get this about 3 or 4 inches deep. There. That looks pretty good. Now, all I'm going to have to do is leave this over the winter time, and the newspaper under there will rot, and everything will soften, the grass will die, and I'll have a wonderful planting bed ready for me in the spring. Come spring, all I'm going to need to do is take a trowel and poke a hole right through that nice, soft, rotting newspaper and the mulch, dig a little hole, and put in my plants. Big improvement, I'd say.
This little crop germinating here is mosh, or corn salad, and it's one of my favorite winter greens. But since it's a winter crop, it's hard to get it to germinate in the warm soil at the end of summer. So in this case, I take advantage of shade. Shade keeps the ground cooler, and that's why I sowed this row in the shade of these fall peas. And then I doubled it. After I planted that, I put this little board over there to make it even cooler and shadier. And the trick is, you have to lift it every day and look under there, and when the first little shoots come up, then you fold this back, you know you've got them germinated, then they get light, and then they'll grow.
The shade cast by buildings is a whole other issue from the shade cast by trees. It's a much more severe kind of shade than a tree canopy is. Obviously, the southern side of a building is going to be pretty sunny unless trees are shading it. The eastern side of the building is going to get some morning sun. The western side will get some western sun, which is much stronger than the morning sun that you get. But the north side of the house is the one that gives gardeners a lot of problems. Here's the north side of a cottage, which even has a hemlock tree to make it even the more shady. But there's really quite a bit flourishing right here. Leucothui over here is doing beautifully in dense shade. A rhododendron here is blooming just fine. And there's a carpet of woodland species here that are lovely. This toothwort here has already bloomed. It had a white flower in late April, early May. Some Virginia bluebell came up through it. The ferns are beautiful. There's some hay-scented fern and some maidenhair fern to soften this effect a little higher up. And these Turk's cap lilies that are towering over everything are going to be blooming a little later on. And here, right under the overhanging hemlock branches, are some woodland phlox in both white and blue, in full shade on the north side of the building.
When most people think of plants and sunshine, they think of photosynthesis. And one writer has described photosynthesis as the manner by which plants harvest the sunshine. A nice phrase. I like to think of it as the bridge between chemistry and biology, because photosynthesis is the method by which plants can use the elements in the air and water and combine them in order to make starches and sugar. Chlorophyll is a catalyst in this process. Now, when plants grow in the shade, then, does that mean that they don't photosynthesize? Oh, in no way, because it's important to all plants. But what it does mean is that plants to do so. For example, this sprig of rosemary, which is from a Mediterranean plant that grows out in the hot sun, has leaves that are adapted to those conditions. Whereas this hardy kiwi, which is growing successfully in the complete shade of the north wall of this fence, has larger leaves and obviously a more efficient system of photosynthesis in order to let it grow here. Now, it also, interestingly enough, is a climber, and so it can climb up and find the amount of sun it needs. There are a lot of niches in nature, and plants have adapted to grow in them depending on how much sun they need in order to make all their processes work successfully.
A lot of garden plants that take part shade are spring blooming, but there are a number that you can grow that will flower in summer as well. Now, astilbe is an old favorite of many gardeners because it's so easy to grow and it has these lovely, fluffy flowers. Spiderwort is a lovely old-fashioned one, too. This one's an intense shade of blue. Now, here's one you might not be as familiar with, Campanula americana, an American native with a tall blue spike. Or this one of my absolute favorites, snakeroot, which is forming a towering clump here. Another name for it is fairy candles, and you can see why, with these tall, fuzzy spikes towering at the back of a garden. Another great back-of-the-garden plant for part shade is Canada lily, which ranges in color from yellow to orange to red on tall, sturdy stems. And here's another thing to try, plants that have berries, which are interesting later in the season. This baneberry bloomed quite early, but it hangs on to these lovely, fat, red berries all the way into fall. And when the end of the season comes, you'll still have some late summer color if you've planted Lobelia syphilitica, an American native with bright blue flowers in these spikes. Or you might have some foxgloves that are still blooming. Or best of all, turtle heads. I don't know why everybody doesn't grow this plant that has some shade. Not only has pretty purpley pink flowers, but the best thing of all is when those late summer thunderstorms strike, it still holds up its head proudly. We've been talking a lot about ornamental plants that you can grow in partly shaded situations, but what about vegetables? Most people think it's impossible to have a good vegetable garden unless you have full blazing sun. Well, it is true that you should pick the sunniest part of your property for your vegetable garden, but if you don't really have a lot of sun, don't give up. You can grow vegetables in part shade.
Oh, yeah, determined vegetable gardeners are never going to say they can't do something. And the fascinating thing is that the leafy vegetables and the root crops actually need less sun than the fruiting crops. So if you have a shady spot, stick to lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, beets, carrots, kale, watercress. They'll all do quite well. Now, maybe they won't grow as quickly or be as large as they would in a sunny spot, but you're still going to get a very nice harvest.
Now, that's also true of the leafy herbs. You could try growing dill if you don't have a lot of sun. Tarragon would do okay. Parsley would do fine. Mint would probably prefer it. And I've also found that chervil is better with a little bit of shade to keep it from going to seed too quickly.
Now, as in any difficult situation, there are plants that like conditions, and there are plants you're told won't grow there. But I never believe the naysayers. And I think there are always enough gardeners out there who are going to try something new, and maybe you'll be the one who'll find out that, hey, everybody said this couldn't be done in the shade, but I'm growing it successfully now.
And when you do, write us and tell us about it. We'll be the first to know. For now, goodbye and good gardening.
Next on TLC, doing something for your home can be easy, even fun. Check and see here on Homebodies. Then, add value to your home with some serious improvements. The Home Pro shows you how.